The afternoon light fell soft and warm through the kitchen window of the Cooper home on the second Tuesday of June, 1973. Outside, the cottonwood trees swayed gently, their leaves whispering in a breeze that carried the scent of freshly turned soil from the neighbor's vegetable patch. Inside, 4-year-old Brian played on the linoleum floor with a set of wooden blocks, his small fingers sorting the red ones from the blue, stacking them into crooked towers that wobbled and fell. He wore his favorite striped t-shirt, green and white, and a pair of tiny brown leather sandals his grandmother had sent for his birthday 3 weeks earlier. Those sandals, scuffed at the toes and smelling faintly of rubber cement, would become the object his mother Linda Cooper held at night when sleep refused to come, the only piece of her son she could touch when everything else dissolved into questions. The leather carried the ghost of his footsteps, the memory of how he ran through the house in the mornings, each step accompanied by a soft squeak that made Linda smile. Linda stood at the stove, stirring a pot of tomato soup, the spoon clinking against the ceramic in a rhythm she didn't notice anymore. She glanced at the wall clock, 2:45, and made a mental note to start laundry before her husband Robert came home from his shift at the grain elevator. The radio on the counter played low, a Johnny Cash song trailing into an advertisement for farm equipment. Outside, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The world felt ordinary, predictable, wrapped in the drowsy warmth of mid-afternoon. But already, without her knowing, something had shifted. A car had turned onto their street, slowing near the driveway, engine idling. The driver watched the house with an intensity that would have alarmed anyone who noticed, but no one did. Across town, a woman Linda had never met was folding a set of infant clothes into a canvas bag, her hands trembling with a hope that had curdled into obsession years earlier when her own child had been stillborn. Robert arrived home early that day, his boots heavy on the porch steps. He called out as he opened the screen door, and Linda turned from the stove, surprised. He looked pale, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the room in a way that made her stomach drop. "You need to check the yard," he said, his voice low and strange. Linda wiped her hands on a dish towel, confused, and followed him outside. The backyard was empty. The gate hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Brian's red ball sat in the grass near the fence, but Brian was gone. They called his name, first calmly, then louder, voices cracking as panic crept in. Linda ran through the house, checking closets, under beds, behind the sofa, her breath coming in short gasps that burned her throat. Robert sprinted down the alley, scanning every shadow, every gap between houses. The neighbor's dog barked again, a sound that now seemed ominous. The cottonwoods went on whispering, and in the kitchen, the soup boiled over, hissing against the burner, filling the room with the acrid smell of burning tomatoes. Within 20 minutes, the street was crowded. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by Linda's cries, and fanned out across the neighborhood in pairs and small groups. Someone called the sheriff's office. Within the hour, deputies arrived, followed by a search coordinator from the county, a man named Gerald Bledsoe, who carried a clipboard and spoke in the measured tones of someone who had done this before. He asked Linda and Robert to describe Brian: hair color, clothing, distinguishing marks. Linda's voice kept breaking. She kept saying, "His sandals, the brown ones, they squeak when he runs. You'll hear him before you see him." Robert stood with his arms crossed, staring at the open gate as if it might offer an answer, as if by sheer force of will he could rewind time and lock it. Bledsoe divided the volunteers into search grids, assigning sectors that radiated from the Cooper home in concentric rings. By nightfall, more than 60 people were combing fields, irrigation ditches, abandoned sheds, and the scrubby creek bed that ran behind the neighborhood. Flashlights bobbed in the darkness like fireflies, each beam carrying a silent prayer. If you're drawn to stories of endurance, investigation, and the quiet miracles that sometimes emerge from decades of uncertainty, please subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These cases connect us across time and distance in ways we often don't expect. The first promising lead came on the third day. A gas station attendant 2 towns over reported a woman matching the description of someone seen near the Cooper home the afternoon Brian disappeared. She had paid for fuel in cash and asked for directions to the interstate. The attendant remembered her because she had a young child in the back seat, a boy, maybe 3 or 4, wearing a striped shirt. The detail electrified the investigation. Deputies raced to interview the attendant, pulled surveillance footage from the station's grainy black and white camera, and traced the license plate to a rental car returned in Denver 4 days later. They contacted Denver police, who located the renter, a traveling nurse named Diane Hutchins, who had been visiting family in the area. When investigators finally reached her by phone, she confirmed she had a son, showed them photographs, and provided school records. The boy's name was Daniel. He was 5, not 4, and his striped shirt was red and yellow, not green and white. The lead evaporated like morning dew. Linda wept in the sheriff's office, a sound so raw that Bledsoe had to step outside, his own eyes stinging. The toll on the Cooper family was immediate and crushing. Robert took a leave from work, but after 2 weeks, the bills forced him back to the elevator, where he moved through shifts in silence, his co-workers unsure what to say. Every sympathetic glance felt like a knife. Linda stopped sleeping. She sat at the kitchen table until dawn, drinking cold coffee and staring at the empty chair where Brian used to eat his cereal, tracing her finger over the wooden grooves he had carved with a spoon one morning, a constellation of tiny dents she had scolded him for. Now she would give anything to hear that scraping sound again, to see him grinning with milk on his upper lip. The house filled with flyers, envelopes, photocopies, Brian's face staring out from 1,000 sheets of paper that neighbors stapled to telephone poles and handed out at grocery stores. The Cooper's phone rang at all hours with tips that led nowhere. A boy spotted at a rest stop in Wyoming, a child seen boarding a bus in Nebraska, a shadow that looked like him in the background of a family photograph taken at a county fair. Each tip demanded follow-up, each follow-up ended in disappointment, and each disappointment carved another hollow space in Linda's chest. By autumn, the official search had scaled back. Bledsoe still called once a week, his voice kind but increasingly resigned. The case files sat in a metal cabinet at the sheriff's office, updated sporadically when a new tip trickled in or a jurisdiction requested information. The FBI had been involved briefly, but found no evidence of interstate trafficking or organized abduction. The prevailing theory was that Brian had wandered off and met with an accident. But no body was ever found, no clothing, no trace. The uncertainty became its own kind of torture. Linda couldn't mourn because there was no proof of death. She couldn't hope because there was no proof of life. She existed in a liminal space, suspended between worlds, and it aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. Robert tried to hold the family together, but by the second Christmas the marriage was fracturing under the weight of unspoken blame and shared grief. They barely spoke. They moved through the house like ghosts haunting the same space, but while the active search faded, the procedural thread, the quiet, methodical work of documentation and preservation, continued in small ways. Bledsoe had taken fingerprints from Brian's bedroom, lifted from a wooden toy chest, and a glass of milk left on the nightstand. He had collected a baby tooth Linda had saved in a jewelry box and a lock of hair from Brian's first haircut, stored in a paper envelope with the date written in Linda's careful script. These items were logged into evidence, catalogued with a case number, and placed in storage. At the time, DNA analysis was a distant dream, a concept confined to research labs and theoretical papers. But Bledsoe, who had studied criminal justice by correspondence and read every forensic journal he could find, believed that someday science might catch up to hope. He wrote in his case notes, "Physical evidence preserved for future analysis. Maintain chain of custody." It was a small act of faith, a message in a bottle thrown forward into a future he would never see, a gamble that somewhere down the line someone would have the tools to read what he had saved. Decades passed with the slow, inevitable erosion of memory. Linda Cooper died in 1998, her heart giving out quietly one evening as she sat in the same kitchen where she had last seen her son. The brown sandals were beside her bed, wrapped in tissue paper, untouched. Robert followed in 2004, his obituary listing one surviving child, Brian's younger sister, born 2 years after the disappearance, a child conceived in the desperate hope that new life might fill the void. The case file was transferred twice as the county reorganized its records, eventually landing in a storage facility on the outskirts of town where hundreds of cold cases waited in cardboard boxes, sealed and silent. The world moved on. Technology changed. And in laboratories across the country, genetic analysis evolved from experimental to routine, from prohibitively expensive to accessible, from the domain of scientists to the toolkit of detectives. The turn came in 2019 when a newly hired county archivist named Peter Lang began digitizing old case files as part of a statewide initiative to modernize law enforcement records. Lang was methodical, curious and slightly obsessive, qualities that served him well as he worked his way through decades of paperwork. When he reached the Cooper case, he paused. The file was thick, filled with handwritten notes, witness statements, search grids, and Bledsoe's careful annotations. At the back of the file, in a sealed evidence bag, were the biological samples Bledsoe had preserved. Lang flagged the case and sent a memo to the county's newly established cold case unit, a small team led by Detective Angela Reeves, who had returned to her hometown after 15 years with the state police. She had seen enough unsolved cases to know that closure, even decades late, could still change lives. Reeves read the file twice, tracing the timeline with a highlighter and making notes in the margins. She contacted the state forensics lab and inquired about the viability of extracting DNA from a 50-year-old hair sample and tooth. The lab technician, a woman named Dr. Chloe Park, was cautiously optimistic. She explained that hair without a follicle offered limited nuclear DNA, but the tooth, if stored correctly, might yield a usable sample. The pulp inside baby teeth contained cells rich with genetic material, and if Bledsoe had kept it dry and sealed, there was a chance. Reeves authorized the analysis, knowing it was a long shot, but unable to let the opportunity pass. 3 weeks later, Park called with results. She had successfully extracted a partial DNA profile from the tooth's pulp, enough to build a genetic signature that could be entered into the combined DNA index system, known as CODIS, a national database that cross-references profiles from crimes, missing persons, and unidentified remains. Reeves submitted the profile, expecting nothing immediate, prepared for a long wait. But she also took a less conventional step, one that had only become viable in recent years. She contacted a genetic genealogy firm that specialized in cold cases, uploading Brian's DNA profile to a public genealogy database where millions of people had voluntarily shared their genetic information in hopes of finding relatives or tracing ancestry. This process, known as forensic genetic genealogy, had solved dozens of cold cases in recent years by identifying distant cousins or second-degree relatives and then building family trees backward to narrow down potential matches. The firm assigned a genealogist named Victor Park, who began constructing a tree from the DNA matches that appeared. It was painstaking work, requiring cross-referencing census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries. Over 6 months, Victor worked backward through generations, tracing lines that branched and converged, identifying a cluster of relatives in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. He traced them to a family line that included a woman named Judith Callahan, born 1941, who had lived in the same county as the Coopers in the early 1970s. Reeves pulled Judith Callahan's records. She had been employed as a seamstress, married briefly in her 20s, divorced, and lived alone in a small rental house about 12 miles from the Cooper home. In 1973, Judith had suffered a stillbirth at 32 weeks, a tragedy documented in hospital records. The attending nurse had noted that Judith refused counseling, became increasingly withdrawn, and was discharged against medical advice. 3 months later, neighbors reported that Judith had a young boy living with her, a child she introduced as her nephew, visiting for the summer. But there was no nephew. Judith had no siblings, no extended family with children that age. The boy stayed through the fall, then vanished from the public record. Judith moved to Arizona in 1974, and the trail went cold. Reeves contacted authorities in Arizona, who located Judith in a care facility near Tucson. She was 83, suffering from advanced dementia, unable to answer questions. But her medical records included a notation from a 1998 intake form. She had listed a son, Gregory Callahan, born 1969. The dates didn't match Brian's birth year exactly, but the discrepancy made sense. If Judith had falsified documents to conceal the boy's identity and make him appear older or younger as needed. Reeves obtained a photograph of Gregory from the Arizona DMV. She compared it to the age progression images forensic artists had created of Brian over the years. The resemblance was striking. Same jaw structure, same wide-set eyes, same slight asymmetry in the ears that Linda had mentioned in her original statement. Gregory Callahan lived in a suburb of Phoenix, working as an HVAC technician. He was married, had 2 teenage children, and had no idea his life was built on a fracture. Reeves flew to Arizona with a victim advocate and a psychologist, preparing for an encounter that would require precision, empathy, and patience. They met Gregory at his home on a Saturday morning. Reeves introduced herself, explained that she was investigating a cold case, and asked if he would be willing to provide a voluntary DNA sample. Gregory was confused but cooperative. He swabbed his cheek, signed the consent form, and asked what this was about. Reeves said gently, "We're trying to identify someone who went missing a long time ago. Your cooperation helps us rule things out." She didn't tell him yet that he might be that person. The kindness of that omission would haunt her later, but protocol demanded caution. The lab processed Gregory's DNA in 3 days. Park called Reeves at 6 in the morning. "It's a match," she said. "Probability of paternity exceeds 99.9%. Gregory Callahan is Brian Cooper." Reeves sat in her car outside the station staring at the phone. She had worked cold cases for years, but this was the first time she had found someone alive. The magnitude of it pressed against her chest. 52 years, a stolen childhood, an entire identity built on a lie. She called the victim advocate, a man named Luis Herrera, and together they returned to Gregory's home. The encounter unfolded slowly, carefully. Reeves and Herrera asked Gregory to sit down. They explained that the DNA test had revealed something unexpected. Reeves opened a folder and placed 2 photographs on the table, one of Brian Cooper at age 4, wearing his green and white striped shirt and brown leather sandals, and one of Robert and Linda Cooper standing in their kitchen in 1973, hope and exhaustion etched into their faces. "Gregory," Reeves said quietly, "we believe you were born Brian Thomas Cooper. You were taken from your home in June 1973. The woman you knew as your mother, Judith Callahan, was not your biological mother." Gregory stared at the photographs. His hands began to shake. He said, "That's not possible. I remember my childhood. I remember my mother." But even as he spoke, fragments began to surface, strange, disjointed memories he had never been able to place. A house with a screen door that creaked, a kitchen that smelled like tomatoes, a pair of sandals he had loved, brown and squeaky, that disappeared one day and were never mentioned again. He had always assumed they were part of some half-remembered dream, neurons misfiring, imagination filling gaps. Now, looking at the photo of Brian Cooper, he saw those sandals on the child's feet, and something inside him broke open. The room tilted. Herrera placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him, and said softly, "Take your time." The truth emerged piece by piece over the following weeks. Judith Callahan had been watching the Cooper home for days before the abduction, waiting for a moment when the gate was unlocked and the adults distracted. She had taken Brian quickly, lifting him into her car while he was playing near the fence, and driven him across county lines within the hour. She began the process of erasing his identity almost immediately. She told him his name was Gregory, that his father had died, that they were starting a new life together where no one could hurt them. She homeschooled him for the first 2 years, avoiding questions, avoiding neighbors. When they moved to Arizona, she enrolled him in school with forged documents, claiming his birth certificate had been lost in a fire. Gregory, Brian, grew up believing the lie because he had no reason not to. Children trust the adults who raise them, even when those adults are architects of theft. He had no memory of his life before Judith, because trauma and time had erased it, the way water smooths stone. The legal consequences for Judith Callahan were muted by her condition. Prosecutors in Colorado filed charges of kidnapping, but her dementia rendered her incompetent to stand trial. She died in the care facility 8 months after the identification, never having regained clarity, never having offered an apology or explanation. For Gregory, the revelation was seismic. He spent months in therapy, working through the cognitive dissonance of having 2 identities, 2 sets of memories, 2 truths that couldn't coexist, but somehow had to. His wife stood by him, but the strain was visible in the careful way they spoke to each other, in the silences that grew longer. His children struggled to understand how their father could be someone else, how his entire history could shift overnight. He changed his legal name back to Brian Cooper, but it felt like wearing someone else's clothes. He didn't know who Brian Cooper was. He only knew who Gregory Callahan had been, and now even that felt unstable, built on sand. Reconnecting with his biological family brought its own complications. Brian's younger sister, now in her 50s, had no memory of him, but welcomed him with cautious hope. They met in the same town where he had been taken, stood together in front of the old Cooper house, and cried without speaking. She showed him photographs, told him stories their mother had shared about him, how he loved building things, how he laughed when it rained, how he used to hum to himself while he played. Brian listened and felt nothing. These were facts about a stranger. Yet slowly, over months of conversations, visits, and shared grief, a fragile connection began to form. It wasn't the relationship they had lost. That was gone, irretrievable. But it was something new, something built on patience and the small, quiet choice to show up. Therapy became the scaffolding of Brian's reintegration. His psychologist, Dr. Angela Tran, specialized in complex trauma and identity disruption, and she helped him navigate the paradox of mourning a childhood he didn't remember while grieving the childhood he did. She introduced him to the concept of ambiguous loss, grief that lacks closure, that cannot be neatly resolved because the person is both gone and present. Brian attended support groups for adoptees and victims of parental kidnapping, spaces where others understood the strange dislocation of discovering your origin story had been a lie. He learned that healing was not linear, that some days he felt more like Brian, and other days he felt only like Gregory, and that both were valid. There was no rule book for this, no map, only the slow, uncertain work of building a self from fractured pieces. The case drew national attention. News outlets covered the story, framing it as a miracle of modern forensic science, a cold case solved after more than 50 years. Victim advocacy groups used it as an example of why biological evidence should always be preserved, even when cases seem hopeless. The county established a fund in Linda Cooper's name to support forensic genealogy work on other unsolved abductions. Reeves gave interviews emphasizing the importance of interagency cooperation, public databases, and the willingness of ordinary people to contribute their DNA for the greater good. She kept a photograph of Brian, both as a 4-year-old in striped shirt and sandals and as a 56-year-old man standing beside his sister, on her desk as a reminder that resolution, however complicated, was always worth pursuing. In the years that followed, Brian returned to the house where he was taken. The current owners, a young couple with children of their own, allowed him to walk through the rooms. He stood in the kitchen, now repainted and remodeled, and tried to summon a memory, a feeling, anything that might anchor him to the boy he had been. Nothing came. But when he stepped into the backyard and saw the cottonwood trees still standing, their leaves whispering in the same wind that had blown the day he disappeared, something shifted. Not a memory, more like an echo, a sense of something familiar and lost. He knelt in the grass and pressed his hand against the ground, feeling the coolness of the earth, the stubborn persistence of roots. His sister stood nearby, silent, giving him space. After a long moment he stood, brushed off his jeans, and nodded. "Thank you," he said, though he wasn't sure to whom. Maybe to the boy who had been taken. Maybe to the man who had survived. Maybe to the mother who had never stopped hoping, even in death. Brian's story became part of a broader movement, advocating for policy changes in how missing children cases are handled. He testified before a legislative committee, urging the allocation of funds for cold case DNA analysis and the expansion of public genetic databases. He partnered with organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, lending his voice to campaigns that encouraged families to submit DNA samples and maintain updated records. He was careful, in all of this, not to present himself as fully healed or as a symbol of uncomplicated triumph. He spoke openly about his struggles, his ambivalence, the parts of him that would never be whole. "I'm not a miracle," he said in one interview. "I'm a man who found out he'd been living someone else's story, and now I'm trying to write my own." The brown leather sandals, the ones Linda Cooper had kept in a box beside her bed for 25 years until she died, were returned to Brian by the county. They were small, impossibly small, scuffed and worn, the leather cracked with age. He held them in his hands and felt the weight of everything they represented. A life interrupted, a mother's grief, a truth that took half a century to surface. He placed them on a shelf in his home, beside the photographs of his children and the life he had built as Gregory Callahan. They sat there as a bridge between two worlds, a reminder that identity is both fragile and resilient, that we are shaped by the stories we are told and the truths we eventually uncover. Sometimes he looked at them and felt nothing. Other times he looked at them and wept. Today, Brian Cooper continues to live in Arizona, balancing his work, his family, and the ongoing process of understanding who he is and who he might have been. He stays in regular contact with his sister, speaks at conferences about trauma and reintegration, and supports legislative efforts to improve resources for cold case investigations. He has also become an advocate for victims of parental abduction, a crime that often goes unrecognized because the child is still alive, still cared for in some fashion, but whose identity and autonomy have been stolen. He emphasizes that recovery is possible even when it looks different than expected, and that the systems designed to find the missing must never give up, even after decades of silence. For those touched by cases like Brian's, families waiting for answers, investigators working against time, communities holding space for the lost, the message is clear. Preservation of evidence, investment in forensic technology, and the willingness to revisit old files can change lives. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children maintains resources for families navigating long-term disappearances, and organizations like DNA DOE Project and NAMUS offer avenues for submitting genetic information and unidentified remains. The landscape of what is solvable continues to expand, and with it, the possibility that more stolen lives might be reclaimed, more fractured families might be brought together, and more cold cases might finally, after years of silence, speak their truth. Brian's story is a testament to the endurance of hope, the power of science, and the complexity of identity. It reminds us that resolution is not always restoration, that finding someone does not erase the years lost, but that even imperfect answers are better than endless questions. It asks us to hold space for ambiguity, to recognize that healing can coexist with grief, and to believe that justice, however delayed, however incomplete, still matters. And it anchors itself in a small, tangible detail, a pair of brown leather sandals, scuffed and worn, carried forward through time as proof that some things, however fragile, refuse to be forgotten.